Good afternoon, guys. This is attorney Philip Adams with the law offices of Philip Adams here in Shreveport, Louisiana. And I want to take some time to talk to you about what I consider to be a fascinating science topic, particularly the limitations of secondary transfer DNA evidence in criminal cases. Now, Louisiana criminal cases, especially serious felonies such as homicides, rapes, unarmed robberies, and burglaries, often involve DNA evidence. Often, law enforcement officers will swab crime scene evidence in particularly serious cases because they can justify the costs that are later associated with running that DNA evidence through a laboratory to see if it can be perhaps a match obtained with someone else's DNA that might be on file. Often in less serious cases, the cost is not merited or not worthwhile in the eyes of many law enforcement agencies. And that's because we, of course, have limited financial resources, limited manpower available to process DNA within our criminal justice system. In an ideal world, we could swab everything for DNA and potentially solve far more crimes. But in the real world, we're limited in terms of how often and when we can utilize DNA swabbing in an attempt to solve crimes. So that's why we reserve the use of DNA typically for more serious cases. Now, what does DNA actually mean? Well, DNA is actually an acronym. It stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It's an acronym that derives from biology. So DNA is a biological polymer that can be transferred in heredity from one person to another person. Almost every cell in the human body has DNA present within it. You can think of DNA as almost being like an instruction book that teaches cells how to function, how to grow, how to reproduce, how to replicate, how to repair themselves, and so on. Now, although DNA science is incredibly complex and nuanced and rapidly evolving as a subject matter, for purposes of this discussion, it is enough for you to understand that DNA is a hereditary material that is contained within almost every cell of a human individual. Because of its hereditary properties, DNA is a remarkably useful tool in assisting law enforcement investigators and forensic scientists in criminal investigations. DNA can be collected from blood, hair, skin, semen, and so on. The real power of DNA lies in its ability to show physical contact between a given person's DNA and an object or scene. Now, although DNA is an incredibly useful investigative tool, it does have serious limitations that are often not well understood or appreciated by laypersons who are unfamiliar with DNA science. A simple example will suffice to demonstrate what it is that I'm talking about when it comes to limitations of DNA. Now, many other limitations exist for sure, but for now, I think one limitation, DNA transfer, can be discussed to show you what it is that I'm talking about. So consider the simplified hypothetical that I'm going to discuss. You're person A. Your hands contain skin cells, right? And each of those skin cells contains DNA within their nuclei. You're sweating after a long workout, and while you're working out, the skin in your hands perhaps got kind of abraded somewhat from tight gripping of a metal bar while you're deadlifting, for example. And those abraded skin cells are barely hanging onto your hand and are ready to slough off at any given moment in time, just given the right circumstances. Right after your workout, your hands are a rich repository of DNA, your DNA, particularly within your sweat and your skin cells on your hands. So you finish your workout and you shake hands with person B. And in the process of shaking hands, you transfer the sweat and skin cells on your hands to the hand of person B. This action would be what we refer to as a primary or direct transfer of DNA. Person A's DNA is directly transferred to person B during the handshake. So person B now has person A's DNA on person B's hand. Person B doesn't wipe his hands or take any other measure to rid himself of person A's DNA. He's not even thinking about person A's DNA on his hands. Now, let's make things more interesting. Person B leaves the scene, the presence of person A. Say they were both at the gym. Person B leaves the gym. Person A remains at the gym. Within a half hour, person B is somewhere else. Person B takes the same hand that he used to shake person A's hand, grabs a pistol out of a glove box in his car. Maybe he's angry at somebody. And in grabbing that pistol, say person B has now transferred some of person A's DNA from the sweat and skin cells that got on person B's hands to the grip and trigger of this pistol that person B is now holding. This type of transfer would be known as a secondary transfer of DNA. There was the direct transfer, boom, A to B, and then B transfers to the gun, secondary transfer. So person B takes this same gun and then shoots and kills somebody in a drive-by shooting. Nobody else sees person B shoot. Person B then tosses the gun to the ground. Law enforcement later arrive at the scene. They recover the gun. They swab it for DNA, the handle, the trigger, the whole gun, and they wind up actually retrieving DNA from the gun in this situation. DNA is not always retrieved during swabbing, but let's say it is in this hypothetical. Shell casings are examined from the scene of the crime. Those shell casings, through ballistics testing, also will match the gun that person B had, and are correlated with that gun's barrel. Now, it turns out that person A back at the gym, say, has a prior felony conviction for burglary, and person A previously had to get a DNA sample when he was booked into jail years ago for that felony burglary offense. Coming back to our hypothetical case from this aside, when law enforcement enter at this point in time, unknown DNA that they swabbed from the gun that person B had. Remember, nobody saw person B commit the crime. The gun was tossed. So they're swabbing this gun for DNA. They don't know whose DNA this is. They take the DNA samples and say they enter it into CODIS, what would be the Combined DNA Index System, as we call it. This unknown DNA from this gun winds up matching DNA from person A's prior felony burglary conviction case when person A had to enter DNA into CODIS. Law enforcement now believe that they know who the killer is. They believe that person A is the killer. And assume no other DNA was recovered from the gun in any quantifiable amount, not even person B's DNA, person B being the real person who actually had gripped the gun and utilized it to commit this drive-by shooting crime. Assume that person B's DNA was on the gun since he was the actual killer, but the amount of DNA that was deposited by person B was not enough to be detectable in swabbing or easily quantifiable. So in forensic science, if an insufficient amount of DNA is deposited, when an analyst later arrives at a crime scene and swabs for possible DNA evidence, the amount that's picked up by the swab may not later be enough to biochemically amplify through a process that we call PCR, or polymerase chain reaction. The PCR process is one of several stages that is necessary to match an unknown DNA profile to a known DNA profile. As time has gone on, it is worth mentioning that DNA science has become incredibly more capable of detecting DNA from increasingly smaller and smaller amounts of DNA that are left behind. In the past, it would have taken us, far more skin cells, for instance, in this example, to be able to recover quantifiable DNA through a swab. Now, it could be done with far less because of greater sensitivity in instrumentation and DNA amplification technology. So we know who the real killer is in our hypothetical. The real killer is person B, but the DNA match is indicating as person A to the eyes of law enforcement officers. So the hypothetical transfer of DNA in this case, though, for person A looking like the killer makes sense because his DNA was on the gun. How did that happen? Why might person B's DNA not also transfer to the gun in a quantifiable amount? Well, there are an infinite number of variables that can influence how and why someone's DNA may or may not get transferred to an object in secondary transfer. So things like heat, grip pressure, UV radiation, the angle at which someone touches something, genetics, whether someone is a secretor of a lot of sweat, for instance, can play a role. All these different factors can influence whether and how much DNA is left behind during transfer. Some people even regularly shed more skin cells than other people do, or sweat more than others, thereby leaving behind more potential DNA than others. For the purposes of this hypothetical, let's assume that for whatever reason, person B's DNA did not transfer to the gun, like I said, in a quantifiable amount, even though person B was the one who pulled the trigger and touched the gun. So we now have a situation in which person A, an innocent person, can be brought into the criminal justice system because of an inherent limitation in DNA science that arises during secondary transfer. This risk is heightened if law enforcement investigating the case misunderstand or misapply the DNA results in this hypothetical. An innocent person A could in fact be charged with murder because it looks like he's the killer when he's not, simply based on a DNA swab that's taken out of context. So as this hypothetical just demonstrated, when you encounter a Louisiana criminal case involving DNA science, it is extremely important to hire competent counsel who can meticulously examine all the state's evidence to ensure that you're not wrongfully convicted of a crime. DNA evidence is much more limited in its usefulness than most people realize, and a skilled legal practitioner can expose the limitations of DNA science to a judge and jury and help exonerate someone who might otherwise wrongfully be convicted. Not all individuals understand the science of DNA. In fact, many people do not understand its limitations. If you're factually innocent and facing charges based on a misunderstanding or misapplication of DNA science by law enforcement, perhaps you have an alibi and you can provide context to how your DNA may have got on a murder weapon like we had in this hypothetical. It's important to reach out to a skilled advocate who can fight to demonstrate that you are in fact innocent so you don't become a statistic within the legal system. Take care.